Good Margaret. Ceann Comhairle, we got word last night that the dole schedule was being ripped up, not to address any of the crises gripping the country or to enact some critical piece of legislation. No, it's to spare the government's blushes and to try to prevent a spotlight being placed on the government's shameful treatment of people with disabilities. Aontú had signalled yesterday that it was going to put down a motion of no confidence in the Taoiseach next week, and within hours the wagons circled. The government didn't even wait for the text of Aontú's motion to be published because it was so terrified of the prospect of that debate. Instead, they cobbled together this motion and ripped up the dole schedule so they can tell the rest of us how well they're doing and how good the government's record is when it comes to the treatment of children, the provision of disability services, and indeed other issues like foreign affairs. It really is incredibly cynical. A political stroke to avoid legitimate criticism of their failure of children with disabilities and their families for years. And this exercise in sheer cynicism will go on for 2.5 hours. Ceann Comhairle, is this government so afraid of debate and so afraid of scrutiny on its own record that it has to sink to this level, preempting a confidence motion that hasn't even been written yet? At a time when this country has such major issues in disability services, in housing, cost of living, healthcare and climate action, it really is incredible that the government is choosing to spend its time in this way. It speaks to a complete lack of confidence in the government benches. It's an acknowledgement that your own record is simply not defensible. It also goes to show where the government's priorities lie, namely with itself. It will drop everything and go to war not to improve services for children with disabilities, but to defend itself and shield itself from criticism. The Irish Times was clear about the reason that we're enduring this farce today. Its news pages, not the opinion pages, said today, and I quote, "The government is expected to force through a vote of confidence to diffuse the risk of debate on disabilities during these weeks of campaigning." The government parties are clearly horrified at the thought of a brake being applied to their negative campaigning and a focus being placed on their manner in which it's running the country and its appalling treatment of some of our most vulnerable citizens. And it's no wonder. If you look at the government's record on disability, a failure to even acknowledge the cost of disability in the budget, the highest unemployment rate for disabled people in the EU, and a failure to provide long-awaited justice to thalidomide survivors who were promised a state apology and access to medical cards, not to mention Children's Disability Network teams, personal assistance hours. I could go on and on and on. Ceann Comhairle, recently the current Health Minister was asked in this chamber about the treatment of children waiting for spinal surgery, and she said, "We are making some progress, but I acknowledge that it is too slow and too many children are still waiting." Sounds quite benign and reasonable at first, until important context is provided. For that context, we can start in 2013, when Fine Gael had been in office for 2 years. Back then, 12 years ago, a report into services for children with spina bifida found, quote, "major defects and a lack of coordination at a national and local level." That report made recommendations for how services could be improved. Those recommendations were not implemented. In 2017, a damning Children's Ombudsman report was published called "Waiting for Scoliosis, a Children's Rights Issue." It raised, quote, "huge concerns about serious and ongoing violations of the rights of children waiting for scoliosis treatment," and concluded there was an onus on all of us to act and for the government to fully and meaningfully address all of the issues raised. In response, the then Minister Simon Harris promised no child with scoliosis would wait longer than 4 months for surgery. That promise was never kept. In 2023, the Children's Ombudsman published the Ivy report into care of a child with scoliosis by CHI. Ivy had been waiting for spinal surgery for scoliosis for 5 years, during which time the curve in her spine went from 30 degrees to over 135 degrees. The report detailed how the uncertainty surrounding Ivy's surgery impacted every aspect of her life, physically and mentally, and caused huge distress for her and her family. That report found numerous failures of governance and communications within CHI. In 2024, a follow-up to the Ivy report revealed that Ivy's surgery was delayed for so long that she was no longer operable. That report also noted that grave concerns have emerged around the safety of some children with scoliosis being treated within CHI. This year alone, there have been 3 further damning reports into CHI. We've learned that non-medical grade springs were inserted into children without their parents' consent or knowledge. An independent audit has revealed that nearly 80% of hip surgeries on children at Kappa and nearly 60% at Temple Street were not clinically indicated. This means that potentially hundreds of children have undergone invasive and traumatic surgeries that they may not have needed. And a separate report into CHI raised huge concerns about a negative and toxic culture which impacted service delivery, staff experience, and had the potential to put patients at risk. It doesn't end there. We're currently waiting for the publication of further reports into CHI, including one on paediatric orthopaedic surgery. So can those on the government benches now understand why families of children who rely on CHI for critical treatment have lost trust in it? And all trust in this government to address the dangerously threadbare disability services that it has responsibility for delivering. We have a mountain of reports that are gathering dust on government shelves, none of which have been acted on in any meaningful way, with the result that generations of children are being failed. There have been repeated promises that waiting lists would be addressed and services would be improved. Those promises have been made for at least 12 years. It never happened, and Fine Gael have been in office throughout all of it. With Fianna Fáil propping it up since 2016 before entering coalition in 2020, yet neither party will take responsibility and are instead spending the whole afternoon in the chamber here praising themselves on the things that they are doing. Ceann Comhairle, Harvey Morrison Sharat was just 1-year-old when the Taoiseach made the promise that no child would wait longer than 4 months for surgery. But instead of being cared for and treated quickly, his father Stephen said Harvey was abandoned. He waited years for surgery before finally getting it last November. By then, the curve on his spine had reached 130 degrees, crushing his rib cage and putting pressure on his lungs and heart. Harvey tragically died on the 29th of July. We don't know Harvey's cause of death, but we do know that he needlessly suffered. He endured years of pain and trauma that could have been avoided if he had just been given the health care that he needed. What Harvey endured is not an aberration, it is the norm. Today, as we speak, there are 226 children on the CHI spinal surgery list. 135 of these children are actively waiting for surgeries but don't have a date, up from 108 since the start of the year. Of these, 40 children have been waiting for 6 months or more. Ceann Comhairle, Minister Harris should never have made that promise back in 2017. I think that he accepts that himself. And there have been other health ministers since Simon Harris who have also failed to keep promises on this issue. Last October, just before the election, Stephen Donnelly vowed that the number of children waiting more than 4 months would fall to 20. In part, he said because every child waiting longer than 4 months for treatment would be offered treatment abroad. 12 months on from this commitment, what has happened? Just 8 children have been approved to travel. We now have yet another minister, Jennifer Carroll McNeill, who has vowed to get to grips with this crisis. I welcome her announcement that CHI will be folded back into the HSE by 2027 and that the government will set up an inquiry into the care of children with spina bifida and scoliosis. But that inquiry must be public, and parents and advocacy groups must be centrally involved in setting the terms of reference. While I welcome that, we have had report after report that have highlighted failings and issued recommendations, but they have either been ignored or implementation has failed. So the question must be asked, what is the government doing today to ensure that children with spina bifida and scoliosis are treated swiftly and appropriately? And given their abject record of failure, Can we really rely on the government to deliver the reform and change that is needed?
Thank you,
the answer to that, quite clearly, is no.
Thank you, Deputy. Minister
and for that
Martin
reason,
Hayden.
I and the Social Democrats do not have confidence in this government.
Minister Martin Hayden.